so much for joining the Opportunities for Expanding Protected Areas in Ontario webinar. My name is Melina Damian. I'm Ontario Nature's Communications Manager, and I'll be moderating the webinar today. Before we get started, I'd like to start today's session with a land acknowledgement. As we are not able to gather today in person, I would like to acknowledge that the land where I live and where Ontario Nature's head office is situated in Toronto is within the traditional territory of the Huron-Wendat, Haudenosaunee, and Anishinaabe nations and the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. This territory was the subject of the Dish with One Spoon, Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement between the Iroquois Confederacy and the Ojibwe and allied nations to peaceably share and care for the resources around the Great Lakes. As a settler, I'm grateful for the opportunity to be on this land, and I invite you to join me in reflecting on our responsibility to take care of the land and care for each other in a respectful manner. Now, on to a few housekeeping items before we get started officially. We are recording this webinar for those who are unable to attend or if you're having technical difficulties. You are in listen and view only mode, so that means others cannot hear or see you, but please use the chat to introduce yourselves if you feel like it and to tell us where you're joining from or to ask for any technical difficulties. And to ask questions to the presenters throughout the presentation, please use the Q&A feature and we'll get to them in the end. Thanks again for joining us today. I will now pass it over to Brittney Vezina, our Protected Places Coordinator, who will introduce the webinar.
Thanks, Melina, and hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us tonight to learn about opportunities for expanding protected areas in Ontario. As Melina said, I am Brittney, and I'm the Protected Places Coordinator at Ontario Nature, and I have been working to advance protected areas opportunities in Forest Stewardship Council certified forests in Ontario since 2023. And I will also be joined by my colleague, Tony Morris, who is Ontario Nature's Conservation Policy and Campaigns Director. And he's been leading Ontario Nature's work advancing protected areas in Ontario since 2024, including in Forest Stewardship Council certified forests. So before we tell you more about our work and various other opportunities in Ontario, we'd first like to run a couple of polls to get to know a bit more about who's doing everyone, and welcome. And we'll get started now on the webinar. So first, to let you know what you can expect to learn about today. So I'll start with talking about Ontario Nature and who we are in case you're unaware. And then we'll talk about protected areas and why there's a need for more in the province of Ontario. And then both Tony and myself will talk about various opportunities for expanding protected areas in Ontario. And then Tony's going to go over some policy options for protecting land in the province and how everyone here can join us in urging the province on protecting more land. And we should have plenty of time at the end for questions and comments from the audience. So who is Ontario Nature? So for those of you who may not know, we are a charity that has been protecting wild species and wild spaces for a number of years, since 1931. And we do this work through multiple programs, projects, and campaigns that combine education, conservation, and public engagement. And one such program is the Protected Places program that both myself and Tony work closely on, and which we'll be talking about a lot tonight. And Ontario Nature is a member-based organization with a dedicated network of 150 local nature network groups. And these groups help us identify and engage on local issues across the province. And we are also a land trust. So we own 26 nature reserves across the province, which amounts to over 3,000 hectares of land protected. And so we are going to run another poll just to get another understanding of the audience. If Melina, you can run the third one. So we would like to know how you would rate your knowledge or awareness of protected areas and what is referred to as the 30 by 30 goal, So no knowledge or awareness, you're familiar, but you're not directly working on protected areas in 30 by 30. And this can be in a volunteer aspect or professionally, or actively working on protected areas in 30 by 30. And not worry if you don't have any knowledge or awareness, I'll definitely be talking about it. So we'll just give everyone, but yeah, so what is 30 by 30? So the overarching goal of the Protected Places program is to ensure that Ontario meets the internationally recognized target of protecting 30% of lands and waters by 2030, and this is also known as the 30 by 30 target. So for those unaware, the 30 by 30 target came out of the 15th Conference of the Parties to the United Nations Convention on Biological Diversity, and this was in 2022. At that time, Canada, along with 195 other countries, adopted what's called the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework. And this framework outlines 23 targets that are intended to halt and reverse biodiversity loss, and 30 by 30 is only one of the 23 targets. So protecting 30% of lands and waters by 2030 is considered the minimum amount of area needed globally to maintain biodiversity. And this is based on extensive research across the world that informs these international targets. And when it comes to this number, 30%, it really isn't just about the quantity, it's also the quality. So target 3, 30 by 30, calls for the conservation of 30% of lands and waters, but through ecologically representative, well-connected, and equitably governed systems of protected areas and other effective area-based conservation measures, recognizing Indigenous and traditional territories. So why protected areas? Not only are they beneficial for conserving biodiversity, but they also provide many other benefits, including but not limited to what is listed here. So preserving clean air, water, and soil, their important role as carbon sinks. So it's estimated that increasing protected area coverage to 30% of the globe could reduce carbon emissions by 0.9 to 2.6 gigatons each year. And aside from carbon storage, protected areas also help make ecosystems and biodiversity more resilient to the impacts of climate change. So one example being flood mitigation. If a wetland as small as 2 hectares is protected, this area can retain water runoff from an area 70 times its size. And of course, under climate change, protected areas also provide safe havens for wildlife to adapt as their habitats change. So protected areas can serve a dual purpose in our fight against biodiversity and the climate crises, which are both interrelated, as is the health of our natural world and our own well-being as communities. So lots of benefits. And so why do we need more protected areas in Ontario? So across the globe, nature is unfortunately declining at rates that are unprecedented in human history, and the rate of species extinctions is accelerating, which is putting human well-being at risk. And unfortunately, similar patterns hold true in Ontario. We have over 240 species at risk, but we have just under 11% of the land base protected. And this is despite Canada committing to multiple international targets related to protecting more land over the years. So outside of 30 by 30, there was 17% by 2017 and 25% by 2025, and now 30 by 2030. But unfortunately, Ontario has yet to commit to 30 by 30, while other provinces such as BC, Quebec, and Manitoba now have. And this is also despite Ontario's own provincially appointed Protected Areas Working Group, which is urging the province to do so. And this is also despite overwhelming public support for the creation of more parks and protected areas. And this polling of 86% of Ontarians supporting this is based on research from the Protected Areas Working Group. So there is both a dire need and an opportunity for all of us to reshape our relationship with the natural world. And we can do this by creating a network of protected areas that not only support critical ecosystem services, as already mentioned, but also offer places for recreation and land-based learning, and also help sustain and strengthen Indigenous knowledge systems and cultural practices, of course, if this is done in a good way in partnership with Indigenous communities. And also, this work could help provide clarity for other interests on the landscape, including industry. So, how exactly do we achieve this 30 by 30 target? So we are going to go into specific opportunities across Ontario, but first it's important to understand how it's determined what actually counts towards this 30%. And the most important message I'd like you to take away from this slide is that areas do not have to be what we traditionally view as a protected area for it to count. For example, a provincial park or a conservation reserve or the like. So when areas are assessed to determine if they can count, they will be classified into either one of two categories. So protected areas are one of the categories, and these are simply areas which are managed specifically for biodiversity conservation. So it can include provincial parks or conservation reserves, but this can also include areas like private land trust properties, like Ontario Nature's nature reserves. And these areas may or may not be legally protected under federal or provincial protected areas legislation. And the other category on the right here is other effective area-based conservation measures, which it's easier to remember OECMs. But these are areas that are managed for another purpose while also achieving conservation and biodiversity outcomes. So this could include, university research properties or conservation authority properties. And these lands aren't protected under federal or provincial protected area legislation, such as like a provincial park. But regardless of the classification, there are specific criteria that these areas must meet in order to count. So one being clearly defined boundaries, two being effective means to control all activities that likely negatively impact biodiversity. Three, the management of the land has to deliver conservation outcomes. And four, this work has to be long-term and year-round protection. And so once areas are assessed for these criteria and approved, they're added to the Canadian Protected and Conserved Areas Database, also known as CPCAD, which is the National Inventory of Protected and Conserved Areas. And then they can officially count. So now I'll get into what opportunities exist, and I'll start with what Ontario Nature is doing. So as an organization, we have a long history advocating for and raising awareness about protected areas throughout Ontario. And we do this through various engagement and advocacy opportunities with the government and the general public, through partnership building across the province, and through managing our nature reserves to a high standard. And as an organization, we've also participated in provincial processes as they arise, such as what's called Ontario's Living Legacy in the 90s, which was the last provincially led protected areas planning exercise, so over 20 years ago. And there are three specific projects we have under our Protected Places program. The first one is the Municipal Protected Areas Program. So we work with municipalities and conservation authorities to assess their lands and policies to see if they can count for 30 by 30. So the process I just explained. We're also working on opportunities within Forest Stewardship Council certified forests, which I will get into shortly. And we recently started an ecological corridors project funded by Parks Canada in partnership with Garden River First Nation, Algoma Highlands Conservancy, and the City of Sault Ste. Marie, where we're delineating an ecological corridor in the Sault Ste. Marie Garden River area. And we also provide support to various communities and organizations who are advocating for other priority areas across the province. So what other opportunities exist for protected areas? So as I've already said, one important area of this work is determining what natural areas can count towards 30 by 30. So our work on municipalities, with municipalities and conservation authorities, but this work is also being done for private lands and land trust properties. Ontario Nature's nature reserves were assessed and now count towards 30 by 30. And while a lot of this work is focused on what is already sufficiently protected, and this is very beneficial, having those areas officially recognized in CPCAD, this work can also lead to improving the management of natural areas and strengthening protections in efforts to help them count, which we have been seeing with some of our work with municipalities, which is really great. But for this presentation, Tony and I are going to be focusing on 3 opportunities within Crown land in Ontario, so including FSC certified forest, opportunities through provincial planning and projects, and other opportunities as being identified and worked on by Indigenous communities and conservation organizations. So before getting into the opportunity within FSC Forest Stewardship Council certified forests, it's important to provide some background context. So the majority of land in Ontario is what is considered Crown land, which are considered public lands administered by a provincial ministry. And there are also more than 40 treaties and other land agreements with Indigenous peoples and communities in Ontario. And with so much of Ontario's land base being Crown land, the provincial government can play a major role in achieving 30 by 30, of course, in close collaboration with Indigenous peoples and communities. So seen here is a map showing what is called the managed forest of Ontario, which is a very large portion, as you can see, spanning from Ottawa in the east to Kenora in the northwest. And this is an area in Ontario where forestry companies are given licenses from the province for industrial logging activities. As you can see, a large span of the province, the managed forest has 41 individual forest management units in Ontario, and they make up almost 28 million hectares of land. And out of 41 units, about 50% of them, 19, are forests that are Forest Stewardship Council certified, or I'll be referring to them as FSC certified. So what is FSC certification? So the Forest Stewardship Council is an international certification system that encourages environmentally appropriate, socially beneficial, and economically prosperous management of the world's forests. And there is a specific FSC Canada standard that outlines 10 principles with specific requirements that forestry companies are audited on annually, which allows them to add FSC logos like the one seen here to products that come out of the forest that they manage. So 2 of the most relevant requirements related to our work on protected areas are listed here. So the first one being that companies are required to conduct what are called gap analyses to help identify areas of ecological or cultural significance that are currently underrepresented in the areas that are already protected on the landscape, or which fall into what they're calling the conserved areas network. And then using this gap analysis, companies must work with Indigenous communities and interested stakeholders to identify a minimum of 10% of those forests that they manage and set those areas aside from logging. And so these are processes that Ontario Nature participates in various forests across Ontario. So while these areas are protected from logging through the process, which is great, they are not formally recognized by the province of Ontario, and these lands remain open to mining and other possible development, and even possibly changes to forestry management or certification, as FSC certification is voluntary. So forestry companies can sign on or sign off, depending on their interests. And so an additional key requirement of FSC certification is that forestry companies must work within their sphere of influence to advocate for the permanent protection of these areas only where there is free, prior, and informed consent from Indigenous communities. So its sphere of influence can include organizations such as Ontario Nature or Indigenous communities or other agencies in the province. So Ontario Nature sees this as a great opportunity for the province of Ontario, as much of the heavy lifting in terms of identifying protected areas, going through that scientific gap analysis, which the province typically does, going through a protected areas planning exercise, as well as negotiations amongst various land users and rights holders. And of course, if this process is done well, it already should have had close involvement of Indigenous communities and consent for protection. So essentially, these areas are protected areas in waiting, and there's a potential 1 million hectares of these lands currently in Ontario through the FSC process. So it really is an opportunity for the province of Ontario to move on for 30 by 30 in close collaboration with Indigenous communities, which leads to the project that we have been working on since 2021. So in 2021, we launched a project focused on this opportunity in Ontario. And there are three major areas of work where we've been focused on, much of it occurring concurrently. So first is continuous engagement in the Forest Stewardship Council certification process across Ontario. So in here is another map of the managed forests in Ontario, but it's just highlighting those forest management units that are FSC certified. So as I said, 19 of them. And many of the companies who manage these forests are at various stages of the selection process of these lands. So we're engaging forestry companies to support them in meeting requirements by participating in these gap analysis processes and working groups to help identify lands that are ecologically relevant and important. And we also participate in those annual audits to help hold companies accountable to those FSC requirements. And secondly, where forestry companies have finished the process of selecting the lands to set aside, we are engaging Indigenous communities to understand their priorities for the lands, whether there is support for greater protection, and if there is, the community's preferred policy options for protection. So in the top left corner of the map here, circled in red, is where we're currently piloting this work. And seen here in this map, we're zooming into this forest. It's called Wabigoon Forest. It's located north of Thunder Bay in the area of Dryden. And here, the company managing this forest is called Dryden Fiber Canada, and they led a working group that Ontario Nature was a part of for selecting over 26,000 hectares of important areas to set aside from logging. And this was done back in 2023, and the areas are highlighted here in purple on the map. So we are in the process of learning from the Indigenous communities involved in the working group in this area. And we are prioritizing the priorities of Indigenous communities on policy options and following their lead on any advocacy efforts, while still working with industry and other community groups in the area. And so as a part of this work, we've also been conducting mining assessments to determine where mining claims activity and critical mineral potential overlap with the lands that have been identified. So we're zooming into one of the lands identified here in Wabigoon Forest. And we're just trying to better understand interest in the lands in the area, but also recognizing that mining is a potential barrier to having lands count towards 30 by 30. And so now I'm going to pass it over to Tony. He's going to briefly go over a report that has been supporting us in our work in FSC certified forests. And then he's going to go through the rest of the presentation.
Thanks, Brittney. Next slide. So earlier this year, we released a legal and policy options report that is available on our website. This report, we hope, will help advance discussions on protecting these designated conservation lands that are set aside through the forestry certification process by supporting us in the conversations we're having in pilot area and elsewhere as we explore how to advocate for short-term or long-term protection of these FSC certified designated conservation lands. As already mentioned, there are options beyond the traditional provincial parks or conservation reserves. The report will also help us acknowledge that policy and legal options discussed offer one perspective through Crown legislation, whereas Indigenous nations have their own laws and governance systems that are not necessarily recognized by current Crown legislation. Also recognizing that there's an option to classify areas as other effective conservation measures to count them towards 30 by 30. Particularly where legal designations through colonial legislation may not be desired. The report will also help us support other individuals, organizations, communities that are advocating for protected areas or working on 30 by 30 who may be having similar conversations and trying to answer similar questions. Now I'll go into some of the short-term and long-term protection options discussed in the report. So recognizing that it can take many years to develop plans for a new protected area, interim measures could help secure protections in the short term depending on the local context. Recognizing there's also a push for mining in Ontario, and there's extensive mining claims already across large parts of Ontario, interim measures may be needed to protect from in other industrial uses. So some examples. So a first step for more short-term assurances related to FSC certified forests is ensuring that the forestry companies make reference to their designated conservation lands within their 10-year forest management plans that are required by the province. Recently, Dryden Fiber Canada amended their forest management plan to remove over 3,000 hectares of planned harvest areas that overlapped with their designated conservation lands in our pilot area of Wabigoon Forest. Other short-term options that limit certain land uses within areas include forest reserves. Forest reserves have no logging, but they do have pre-existing mining claims that could be allowed. This designation has been used by the province in the past for areas identified as being important for permanent protection during Ontario's living legacy planning process in the 1990s, but where mining claims and leases existed and prevented the use of other designations like a provincial park. So an example of this is Wolf Lake, also known as Minnegan-Zagan Preserve. Enhanced management areas, there's multiple types of these. They could be for natural heritage, wildlife, recreation, forestry, and other use with various permitted uses, and can be a more flexible option. Black Bay Peninsula on Lake Superior has an enhanced management area, which outlines management direction to maintain the peninsula's remoteness and protect sensitive provincially significant wetlands, while it does allow limited industrial activity. There's also provincial wildlife areas, which are sites managed specifically for wildlife and associated hunting and viewing opportunities. When it comes to long-term protection options, the most commonly thought of options include provincial parks and conservation reserves. This is through Ontario's Provincial Parks and Conservation Reserves Act. There's also Indigenous protected and conserved areas, which may be established by an Indigenous nation under its own legal traditions through existing provincial or federal designations or by a collaborative or co-management agreement that enables Indigenous and Crown governments to partner in planning and management. In Ontario, there's currently no legal or policy pathway that exists for IPCAs, though many Indigenous nations have self-declared these areas, including Grassy Narrows, which has declared Indigenous sovereignty and protected area on their territory. One alternative for long-term protection of designated conservation lands would be to develop a new designation that makes a fresh start, addresses historical challenges, and enables some creative approaches and collaborations. This could be achieved through a number of mechanisms, such as under Indigenous leadership and law, a land use plan, or a new designation under the Public Lands Act. There is also the opportunity of a new class of provincial park under the Provincial Parks and Conservation Reserve Act, or through new legislation that the government could establish. Another option could be to work with the federal government and its agencies to establish any one of a variety of protected areas or other conservation measures under federal legislation, but this would require agreement from the province as well. This has recently occurred through a memorandum of understanding for the Rouge Urban National Park. So this is a living document that will be updated to reflect input from Indigenous communities, industry, and decision makers as we continue to have these conversations. We are currently developing protection scenarios based on our pilot area in Wabigoon Forest and the specific designated conservation lands chosen there. These scenarios will help support conversations with Indigenous communities and other local stakeholders and understand the various options available as well as the pros and cons of each. As we continue conversations, expand engagement efforts to a second pilot area in another FSC certified forest in Ontario, we'll continue to update this document. Now, before I get into how people can join us in urging the government to commit to expanding protected areas in Ontario, I'll briefly highlight the final two opportunities within Crown land for expanding protected areas through past and ongoing provincial planning and projects and other priority areas across Ontario. So the last time there was a large-scale provincial effort for protected areas was the late 1990s, during what I already referred to as Ontario's Living Legacy Land Use Planning exercise. During this exercise, over 300 sites were identified as priority areas for protection, but many were not regulated through the process for various reasons, some of which being mining claims. Ontario Nature was a part of this process back in the 1990s. In August 2024, the Ministry of Environment, Conservation and Parks announced their Expanding Protected Areas in Ontario project, which is focused on regulating many of these leftover sites that were not regulated in the 1990s. The first batch that they were engaging on amounted to just over 100 square kilometers, which will hopefully be added to Ontario's Protected Areas Network. This work by the province can open the door for collective advocacy and conversations about other important areas. Ontario Nature did submit a joint response to the ministry's announcement with 29 other organizations, urging the government to go beyond the areas announced and look at additional areas for protection. We have since met with ministry staff working on the Expanding Protected Areas project, Protected Areas Policy and Crown Land Forestry Policy to discuss other opportunities such as the FSC designated conservation lands. We are hopeful there should be more announcements to come, as well as opportunities for all of us to respond and urge the government to do more and consider other priority areas. Speaking of priority areas, there are many of these opportunities across Ontario that local organizations and communities have been advocating for protection for many years, many of which are highlighted on Ontario Nature's Your Protected Places story map, which Melina will add to the chat. Farbot Peninsula, Black Bay Peninsula, and Wolf Lake Minigan Zagan Preserve, as already mentioned. Cachagoma, Old Growth Eastern Hemlock Forest is another example. Important corridor areas such as the Madawaska Highlands in the east and Michiko River Valley in the north. And areas identified by Parks Canada, 5 of which are in Ontario, where ecological corridors are most urgently needed to conserve and or restore connectivity and has an associated funding program, of which Ontario Nature has received funding for the Sault Ste. Marie region. Work is ongoing by various organizations and communities to determine how connectivity can be improved in each priority region, often in collaboration with multiple regional partners, including Indigenous and non-Indigenous land managers and stewards, experts, grassroots organizations, and decision makers. So we are currently 5 years away from 2030, and only at about 11% of Ontario's lands and waters being considered conserved or protected, which means we have a 19% gap to close. There is a new report recently released on Canada's progress towards 30 by 30, which was released by the Canadian Parks and Wilderness Society. Melina will add that link to the chat, which gave Ontario a failing grade on progress towards 30 by 30, last place in Canada, and a grade that hasn't changed since their initial progress report in 2021. While this is a large gap to close, it is certainly possible given the many opportunities available and the many organizations and communities that are either already doing a lot of good work on this front or willing to put in the work. The CPAWS report also highlighted many other opportunities we haven't mentioned here. There should be no reason why the provincial government cannot step up and become a leader in 30 by 30 and support what is needed and to collaborate with organizations and communities doing this work. We cannot let the economic uncertainty of today stop us from protecting important areas for future generations and to ensure a healthy and sustainable economy into the future. As we already highlighted, we were seeing some progress from the province on protected areas before the recent election. Now is a perfect opportunity to remind the re-elected government that a strong Ontario is one that protects our natural legacy, which is something the majority of Ontarians support, more protected and conserved areas. So, how can the province step up to support this much needed work? First and foremost, the government needs to commit to the 30 by 30 target. Ontario has an opportunity to be a leader on this front alongside Quebec, BC, Manitoba, and the federal government. Additionally, we can continue to remind the province of the work that they themselves have started, first urging them to implement the Ontario Biodiversity Strategy, which sets out a vision, goals, targets, and priority actions to 2030, and includes the target of protecting 30% of lands and water by 2030. But what this strategy currently lacks is a commitment and plan to implement it. The government also needs to commit to the recommendations of its own appointed Protected Areas Working Group from 2021, which are focused on 4 actions: recognize what is already protected and conserved, secure near-term opportunities for new protected and conserved areas, launch a Wild Ontario Accelerator Fund, and articulate a provincial strategy. And lastly, of course, it is important that the province continues implementing its Expanding Protected Areas project, while also advancing opportunities identified by groups across the province in collaboration with Indigenous peoples. Slide. So, never underestimate how a government can respond to public pressure and grassroots organization. We saw this with the Greenbelt. We also saw this with the creation of Monarch Point Conservation Reserve in 2023, the first new conservation reserve regulated in Ontario in over 20 years, as a result of multiple years of local efforts by Prince Edward County's South Shore Joint Initiative and partner groups. We also saw this with the creation of the first urban provincial park in 2024, the Uxbridge Urban Provincial Park, which was the result of over 20 years of local advocacy. It is important to acknowledge that multiple Indigenous communities have declared IPCAs in Ontario and have been urging the province to recognize and respect them for many years. For example, the community of Grassy Narrows First Nation has been united in their desire for a moratorium on industrial activity on their territory for over 20 years, officially declaring their territory an Indigenous Sovereignty and Protected Area in 2008. They secured moratoriums on logging from the province until 2034, but are still fighting battles over unwanted mining. it is time for the province to recognize and respect Indigenous rights. So how can you help expand protected areas? Ontario Nature has a number of helpful tip sheets for influencing decision makers, including writing strong letters, which Melina can also add to the chat. So some tips: ensure local decision makers know who you are by connecting them with them before you need something. Decision makers have a difficult time ignoring a broad base of people with the same or similar positions. So build relationships with diverse people and groups and find common interests. Ensure you're well informed on context of the issue and figure out which decision makers to talk to. Find local champions. Aside from champions from within, do not forget about public servants. They still make many decisions and provide advice to elected officials. The public servants have frequently worked on issues over long term and versus politicians who can change often. Keep any of your submissions brief, focused, and factual, with considerations for alternative solutions and implications for your recommendations. Decision makers want to be perceived as having made the right decision. So politely and persistently reminding them of why this is the right thing to do is a good course to take. You can also join Ontario Nature in our advocacy efforts. We are currently developing a new action alert, which will again remind and urge the province to step up to the plate and become a leader on 30 by 30. And we're asking everyone here to join us. So we'll run another poll. Once that action alert is available, will you sign our action alert and or contact your local? Okay, well, thank you. The majority of you will support this. So you'll certainly, once that's available, you'll be kind of contacted with that information. Thank you. Next slide. So we would want to kind of close off before we go into some questions and discussion with an acknowledgement and thank you to our funders that make this work possible. They're all listed here. Next slide. And yes, thank you so much for listening. And now kind of we want to hear from you. So please feel free to put any additional questions in the Q&A. We also know there are many of you here who are also working on advocating for protecting important places across Ontario. So we invite you to use the chat to comment on any work you're pursuing or comment on any issues your organization or community is running into in your work, or any of the support that you might need to push your work forward. And of course, feel free to ask more questions.
Okay, excellent. Thank you so much, Tony and Brittney, for an excellent presentation. I'm gonna browse the chat and the Q&A feature. We have some questions so far. The first one being, what wetlands have you been able to protect or in the process of protecting?
Sure, I'll take that, I guess. So, I mean, many of our nature reserves do protect very important wetlands. So, a few examples being the Altberg Wetland Nature Reserve, the Gananoque Lake Nature Reserve, and the Hay Marsh Nature Reserve. Also, Ontario Nature does have a wetlands campaign where we also released earlier this year a wise practices report for local wetland conservation, which is targeted at municipalities and the policies and tools they have available to improve wetland protections at the local level, recognizing that protections for wetlands have been weakened over the last few years at the provincial level. But there are still many tools that local communities have at their disposal to do that. So we will be working with our nature network groups and other community organizations across the province to work with municipalities to strengthen protections for wetlands at the local level.
Excellent, thanks so much. We have another question from Melanie. Can we get a copy of the 29 groups who urged the government to go beyond the lands designated in the 1990s?
Yeah, I will put the link for that letter in the chat.
All right. And also another question from Melanie. So, with the 1 million hectares deemed available, would this meet our 30 by 30 target?
Short answer is no. Um, so given the size of Ontario, 1 million hectares essentially represents 1% of the province. So, it's a good opportunity. It's an important opportunity to get us kind of a little closer to that 19% gap, but it in and of itself is not enough.
Mhm. Rachel is asking, has Ontario Nature had any positive experiences with reporting protected areas in Northern Ontario where the Crown retains mining rights? Our land trust members operating in the Northern Ontario struggle with this.
I know that there are some organizations. Sorry, I don't know which organization you're with. You said Rachel, but there are some organizations that through the assessments, they've done some like risk assessments to determine how likely there is actually going to be mining happening on a property. And so there have been areas that have counted towards 30 by 30 despite having mining claims on the properties. I don't know if you can add to that, Tony.
Sorry, for some reason everything froze for me for a minute there. So, which are we on the mining rights question?
Mhm.
And yeah, I think that's where some of the policy options where that have a bit more flexibility in terms of the land uses could potentially come in play. Um, so some of potentially the more interim protections or an enhanced management area. That the kind of subsurface rights is something that we are looking into more, and we'll be having more kind of discussions with the Ministry of Natural Resources as well as the Ministry of Mines on how potentially if it's subsurface mining, how that might be potentially compatible with biodiversity conservation on the surface. So it's a good question, and it's something that yeah we are looking into some more ourselves.
Okay, Darlene Selter of Farbell Peninsula Coalition is asking, what about black ash inventory project? Can you help to get a forest conservation reserve to start off with?
Yeah, I think, hi, Darlene. I think that depends on where that is. I believe you're referring to Faribault Peninsula. Um, And I think any inventory of a species at risk is definitely super helpful. It's unfortunate that the Managed Forests of Ontario is exempt from the Endangered Species Act. So, how that could necessarily trigger extra protection currently under the current context is uncertain, but I do think, you know, collecting as much data and information as possible, particularly for species at risk in areas where you're trying to advocate and push for protection, is super important, especially just never knowing how the political landscape could change in the future. I don't know if you have anything to add specifically about black ash, but Farbit is in the managed forest.
Yeah, yeah, similar to what Brittany said. Like, unfortunately, yes, there's a exemption for forestry in general under the Endangered Species Act, and black ash. There have been quite a few exemptions that have been put in place under the Endangered Species Act specifically for that species. And Ontario Nature has commented on that extensively. But it is any sort of information or any sort of inventory that demonstrates that a species at risk is present and healthy can certainly be helpful and can also help to push kind of changes to strengthen the Endangered Species Act, which unfortunately has been weakened for the last several years.
Okay, Rachel, who asked the question about mining rights, was just clarifying that she works at Ontario Land Trust Alliance. So,
I was just gonna say, yeah, the individuals I'm speaking of were from Land Trust, so you may already know the individuals in the north who were successful in getting lands to count, but we can always connect afterwards to chat more about that.
okay, great. Melanie is asking a question about the upcoming action alert, I believe. She's suggesting that we send it to leaders of the opposition parties as well. Do you have any comments on that?
Yes, it will. It will be directed at the opposition critics and the shadow critics as well. So as well as your local MPP.
Great. We have a question about our use of the term wild spaces, and maybe if you could share a little bit about what are you referring to? Are those spaces where there's no human interaction? Why are we choosing that word to categorize our work?
That's a good question. I don't know if I have an answer for it particularly, but definitely not referring to lands that have no human presence, and definitely recognize how that terminology can infer that. But really, our work is centered around, protecting wild species, and sometimes I like to say instead just their habitats, but certainly not protecting land and envisioning that as not including humans, because fully recognize their importance on the landscape.
Mhm. Yeah, the other thing I'd add, I think, Ontario Nature, in terms of its the way it uses that word, humans are part of nature and part of the landscape as well. So, while we're trying to kind of move past the idea that wild is some other untouched area as well. There can be wild spaces even within an urban center. So.
Yeah, that's a very important conversation to acknowledge. Thank you so much. The next question says, I'm a municipal councillor in a small rural township. We have a small 100-acre wilderness property that we would like to protect in perpetuity. The previous council had planned to sell this property. Do you have any ideas about how we could protect the property for the future?
Yes, short answer again. I think, yeah, certainly through any sort of municipal planning requirements, there's various ways you could go about it. Feel free to reach out. We have Brittney's contacts on the thing, but Brittney can also then flip you to me. And we can certainly chat about that some more. I'd like to learn kind of some more about which township and see if we can help you out on that one.
I can just add like something a bit general from an example from one of the municipalities we work with. Because we going through the process of determining if areas can or cannot count. Some municipalities we've gotten through like a second batch where they initially couldn't count for various reasons. And then there were some changes made that allowed them to count. So some examples were like changing the zoning of certain areas, and other examples were updating the official plan for the city to tighten up some of the wording around certain areas to give more assurances in the long term. But yeah, as Tony said, like conversations beyond here could definitely be had to figure out what could happen there.
Mhm. Thanks so much. Next question is, what are the obstacles to making Canadian forces, bases, and university research grounds as OECMs?
Yeah, that's a good question. So there could be a lot of answers to that question. It really depends on the local context, but when you look at the things that are required, the criteria that are required for areas to count. And Tony, maybe you can add to this, but in my experience and like stories I've heard, a lot of the obstacles that come up are issues, not necessarily issues, but a lack of, say, management plans or something, some kind of mechanism that not only outlines a management direction and plan that will have biodiversity and conservation outcomes, but even in certain plans, like not having the long-term aspect written into them. So the long-term and year-round piece is important, and depending on what the management plan is, that could either count or not count depending on the language within it. So it really has to outline how it's going to be in the long term and year round, and also compel the governing authority, in this case, like the university, to actually implement those management activities in the long term.
Yeah, the only thing I'll add is that there are cases of university lands that have been added. Even though the lands are primarily for research purposes, they still have that, they meet those 4 criteria. And the military based ones, a little more interesting because I don't know if there's example of that. And I suspect that there would be some uses and activities occurring on those lands that would potentially negatively impact biodiversity, particularly if it's testing of arms or equipment and that sort of thing. But you know, who knows? Ontario Nature has a program that we can do the assessment. So if there is an example that you are familiar with, feel free to reach out, and that'd be an interesting one to do an assessment on.
Okay, thanks so much. We have a question from Linda, who's asking if we have worked with the Nature Conservancy of Canada to buy land.
I don't believe we have.
Yeah, I mean, we work closely with various other organizations that the Ontario Land Trust Alliance and Nature Conservancy and others that also do land acquisition. But we don't necessarily have any properties that we're co-managing or anything like that.
No, but I believe we do have properties that are like adjacent or
Yeah.
close by. So I know we collaborate with them a lot on like research and monitoring projects.
Yeah.
Rachel is asking if we have any resources to share related to the mining risk assessments.
Yep, we do. And
Yes.
I will put that in the chat. So we have a mining risk assessment brief that is on our website. And again, it has a contact information if you want more information on that.
I will also add some resources I forgot to add on protected places. So there it goes. Okay, next question is, aside from FSC set-asides, are there any other emerging OECM opportunities in the province to support the 30 by 30 target?
Well, there is ongoing work, well, that's just been initiated also within FSC certified forests, focused on OACM, so beyond the 10% opportunity that we discussed today. And Ontario Nature is also working closely with them on this. So, and it's happening across Canada, but also here within Ontario. So also within the managed forest. Outside of Ontario, the managed forest, Tony, do you have any?
There's the other kind of OACM outside of kind of the managed forest context would be in Southern Ontario. There has been work, like I said, for academic institutions, but also even some municipal lands that actually, or conservation authority lands that serve primarily a more recreational objective, but that still meet the requirements for OECM. So that's our municipal protected areas program is one where we're looking at and assessing municipal or conservation authority lands to see if they meet the standard as either a protected area or as an OECM.
Anne had asked earlier, where does our funding come from? So I know you had that on the previous slide. Maybe you'd like to recap that one more time.
Yeah, so we have a mix of funding from Environment Climate Change Canada as well as private foundations. And that kind of changes year to year. And then, you know, Ontario Nature is a registered charity. So we also do get donations from individuals that support our work.
Okay, thanks so much. We have 5 questions left to address. If others feel like adding more questions, please use the Q&A feature and we'll get to them shortly. Next question by Barb. Do lands owned by a conservation land trust not for profit qualify automatically, or is there a process that is required? And what about land protected by a conservation easement?
So no, the lands don't qualify automatically. There is a process that you have to go through an assessment that follows the Pan-Canadian standard. And there's a decision support tool that both then the provincial government and the federal government kind of use before it's determined whether those lands will be added to the Canadian Protected and Conserved Areas database. So that's something Ontario Nature does do assessments for lands like that. The conservation easement question is a bit more complicated because, yeah, it doesn't necessarily meet all of those check boxes. But there's certainly that still value in conservation easements and potentially some opportunities and strengthening some of that tools. I don't know, Brittney, if you want to add anything else on that one.
Yeah, I was just gonna say conservation easements, yeah, like they definitely depend, but I know that's one route that a university is exploring with our municipal protected areas project. So also a university is working with them on that. It's one option that they're exploring to have some of their lands count. So yeah, definitely possible.
Okay, thanks so much. Next question. Has Ontario Nature engaged in any discussions with mining proponents about potential protected areas that fall within some claims of theirs? And was there any positive feedback?
Yeah, so I mean, we have been in the last year trying to up our up our engagement with mining companies as well as kind of the various associations that represent mining. And we'll continue to have those conversations with the mining industry, particularly around the FSC certified opportunity, and see if there's a willingness to kind of relinquish any kind of claims that might overlap. And so far, yeah, the conversations have been positive and fruitful. So I do think there's certainly opportunity there. So.
Okay. All right, we are down to our last 3 questions. But Rachel just added a clarification in the chat. I'm not sure if everybody can see. She's saying to whoever asked the question regarding the question for land trust properties and CEA properties, at Ontario Land Trust Alliance, we have submitted several CEA batches, and we're working on a land trust template as well. So feel free to reach out. Rachel, if you would like to add your contact information on the chat so others can see, feel free to do so. Okay, so the next question is from Lyle. And Lyle is asking, do you have any examples of successful partnerships between Ontario Nature and local land trusts in Ontario? And what specific conservation outcomes or benefits have resulted from these collaborations?
I can comment on some collaborations that we've been a part of in Southern Ontario in some grassland habitats. So Ontario Nature has partnered with Nature Conservancy of Canada on a variety of prescribed burn research projects related to snakes and snake habitat. So Ontario Nature, we do snake monitoring, and Nature Conservancy of Canada owns a lot of grassland prairie in Southern Ontario. So we've done a lot of collaborations with them to monitor on their properties, and they implement prescribed burns as a management tool. So that's one example where not specifically related to protected areas, though it's on protected land trust property, where we've been collaborating on that kind of work to have positive conservation outcomes for species at risk who rely on grassland habitats.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Brittney. I'm just adding Rachel's contact to the chat. Okay, down to our last two questions. The next one is from Jim. Is there a minimum land area for a property to be eligible to be assessed for protection where black ash and other threatened species are present?
No, there's no minimum area. You know, there are properties that have quite small that have been assessed. So yeah, and particularly, yeah, if it's an area that has black ash and other species at risk, that would show high biodiversity values.
The next question is almost the same. It's the question is, do you have a minimum size for protected areas? I don't know if yeah.
There's no minimum size.
Yeah, no minimum size. Ideally, bigger is better, but like it's also really like dependent on the context of where in Ontario, because like Southern Ontario is super developed, very fragmented. So like protection of anything with biodiversity value is awesome. But yeah, I think the better question is like for what purpose or for what species size wise.
Yeah, I mean, the other thing I think I'd add in terms of obviously, yeah, if it's a smaller habitat patch, but that's potentially isolated, then it's very hard for it potentially to have that high biodiversity value. And that's where, particularly in the area of high development areas, that connectivity is really important. And having whether or not it has different management approaches so that species can move across the landscape and it increases the overall resilience of the ecosystem. So having just isolated small patches of habitat here and there won't really maintain biodiversity in the long run. So that connectivity piece is huge as well.
Okay, thanks so much. I don't see any more questions on the Q&A feature or the chat. So thanks everybody again for attending today's webinar. We will follow up with an email with a recording of the session with resources. Thanks again for